Hi everyone, I'm Cyrielle Filias, the Bilingual Learning and Development Specialist at SARIC, and on behalf of SARIC, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. We are so pleased with the response to this series with nearly 1,000 registrations from around the world, so you're all in a very good company. We are delighted to have Michael Healy live today from his beautiful Australia, who will talk more on his dialogical self theories from the SARIC book, Career Theories and Model at Work. But before Michael gets started, we would like to take a few moments to introduce you to SARIC for anyone who may be unfamiliar with our organization. SARIC is a charitable organization that focuses on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. We fund the development of resources like the Career Theories and Model at Work book in order to advance knowledge in the field. And bringing you learning opportunities like this webinar series is also a key part of our mandate. We are particularly excited about this book since it's a truly international collaboration with contribution from 60 of the leading career researchers and practitioners from 4 continents and 9 countries. Additionally, SARIC has 3 main programs. The Canadian National Career Development Conference held in Ottawa each January. We also have our careerwise.ca website, which features the top news and views in the field. And we have the Canadian Journal of Career Development, which is free to access. You can learn more about all of the SARIC work at saric.ca. Now, just some quick housekeeping notes. If during today's webinar you have any question, please enter them in the question box you see on your screen. Michael will respond to them throughout the webinar. At the end of the webinar series, we will email you a copy of the presentation slide as well as the recording of the 3 webinars. We also encourage you to engage with this webinar on social media using this popular Twitter hashtag that you can see on your screen. Bringing the Career Theories and Model at Work book to life will not have been possible without the tremendous work of the 3 co-editors, Nancy Authors, Mary McMahon, and Roberta Note. And I'm delighted to have Mary McMahon with us, who will say a few words about the book and introduce Michael. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Cyrielle, and good morning, everybody from Brisbane, Australia. I'd like to begin by thanking Cyrielle and SARIC for organising this webinar series on the book, Career Theories and Models at Work, Ideas for Practice, because it's a very important book that we wanted to do, because traditionally there's been a gulf between theory and practice. And one of the sentences that we wrote in our preface to the book really highlights why we wanted to do it, because in career development work currently, it's quite challenging with new types of clients and new types of issues. So really what practitioners need to be equipped with the latest developments in the field. And so these theories and models are really contemporary, the way that people are applying new work in the field. So we felt that that would be a real help to practitioners to be able to not only learn about a range of theories, but also to understand how to apply them in their work. So as Cyrielle said, we were really thrilled with the response when we sought authors for this book, that we actually ended up with 43 chapters, which makes it a very big book. And we have in the book over 60 authors from 9 countries. So it was a fabulous response, and people have really engaged with it. And as you can see with the numbers for this webinar, it seems to have been a topic that's time has come. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce one of the authors to you, Michael Healy, who with Peter McElveen wrote chapter 15 of the book on my career chapter and the use of dialogical self theory. So Michael is a careers and employability educator and doctoral student at the University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba, Australia. And in his practice and research, he's focused on exploring methods of promoting transformational careers and employability learning for his students, particularly using dialogical and social learning methods. Michael is a student member of the Australian Collaboratory for Career, Employability and Learning for Living, that's a research collective at the University of Southern Queensland that explores the role of dispositional traits and adaptations in how people engage in their work and learning. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Michael and welcome him to the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for the introduction, but also thank you for, along with the other editors of the book, for the opportunity of having my name included in that contents list. It was when I saw the list of authors in that book, I was really humbled to be part of that company. And I do really think that this book is an amazing contribution to the literature for practitioners, because I don't know that there's another book like it that presents such a range, such a diverse range of career theory in such an accessible manner. And so I'm very proud to be part of it, and I'm very proud to be here this morning presenting to a large international audience on the work that I'm doing in my PhD and in my practice. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Michael Healy. I am on Twitter. If you have a look at that, if you're on Twitter, you'll see that I'm quite a keen tweeter. My handle is @MojoHealy, and you have my email there. I'd love to hear from people, hear your thoughts, comments, questions on what I'm going to present today. A little bit about myself before I get started. Mary's given you my professional introduction. This is quite a personal topic, the dialogical self, so I'll share a little bit about my personality. I'm a New Zealander, in fact, although I'm now a dual citizen of Australia as well, but I'm Australian by descent. So my father is from Queensland, here where I live now, so I have a bit of a dual nationality. I studied an honours in history when I was at university for the first time. I have a couple of graduate certificates in education and career development, and I'm currently working my way through a PhD, very early stages of that. I'd say I've had 3 major careers in my life, a few minor little bits and pieces there, but 3 main ones: a bookstore manager, ESL teacher, and now a careers and employability educator. I'm a husband to my wife Yi, I'm daddy to little 6-year-old Patrick, and I am, no matter how old I am, I'm always going to be my boy to Len, my father. Patrick will be awake soon. He may make an unexpected appearance in this webinar, so I'll just warn you about that. I'd just like to ask a quick question. I mentioned that I'm a New Zealander and an Australian. My son has 3 passports. He's a New Zealander, Australian, and Vietnamese. So I'd like to ask the audience, just a quick poll, how many national or ethnic identities do you have? I know that Canada is a very multicultural country, and we've got a lot of international participants today. So just a quick poll to see what we have there. Okay, and the results are, lots of people have 1, but there are quite a number there that have 2 or 3. Now, the reason I'm asking about your ethnic identity is because dialogical self, this is a really good example of how it is often used. And that is people who have one, they're born in one country, they move to another one, and they share the 2 different identities, and sometimes reconciling them or bringing them into harmony together can be quite difficult for people. So dialogical self, if you look at some of that literature, has often been applied to immigrants and refugees. And so I asked that question just as a little introduction, a very practical introduction to how it can sometimes be used. Before I move on and continue, I'd just like to take this moment to honor Professor Franz Myers. I dedicate this webinar and much of my work in the memory of Professor Franz Myers. He passed away quite recently. He was my entry point into this topic. So when I was casting about thinking that I'd like to do further research, I came across his work, and that was my entry point into the work that I'm doing. So he has contributed a lot to the career development literature, including these theories of career learning, along with Reineke Lengal, who will be presenting a webinar in this series. They worked on career writing, which I will draw on a lot and I'll refer to a lot in this webinar, and in general narrative career identity, which underpins a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I didn't actually have the chance to meet Professor Franz Myers, which is is a disappointment to me, but I hope that I can honor him in my work. So dialogical self theory. Hubert Hermans is the author of dialogical self theory. And he developed it not primarily for career development, but it has been applied very well to career development by Peter McElveen, my supervisor. Mary Mann has worked with him on some of that. Franz Myers, as I mentioned, Reineke Lengal, and a few other people. Dialogical self theory frames the self not as one single unified entity, but as a society of mind. So there's a multiplicity, a wide range of internal I positions. Those I positions are the different perspectives that we might hold. They might speak in different voices. They're contributing to a dialogue. Now, this shouldn't be reduced just down to the chatter in our heads or the voices in our heads, but it basically is a metaphor to represent the way in which we draw on different experiences, different perspectives, both our own and what we might assume or hear from other people, to create this dialogical approach to making meaning in our life. When we're in times of difficulty, when we're facing challenges, the dialogical self can come up with expressions of crisis and criticism. You know, we often have things like the imposter syndrome, second-guessing ourselves. Perhaps there's someone in our life that was negative towards us, and we hear their contributions. So, you know, the dialogical self can actually create conflict inside of ourselves, and that is something that we look at in using this theory in practice. The good news is that there's the potential for supportive and helpful I positions to emerge, and that's the role of the career counsellor or the career educator to help people do that. Hubert Hermans has talked about three in particular. Meta positions. Meta positions are the ones that sort of sit above the fray. So we consider a noisy, Hubert Hermans liked to use the metaphor of a stage play with every I position acting their role. I think that, personally, I think that's a little bit too organised. I prefer a political forum such as the Parliament of, well, Australia is a good example. And so the meta position sits above that, and it takes a bit of an evaluative approach, and it's a bit more of the mature position that can sort of identify themes, identify cohorts, and does a bit of organising and understanding of things. Third positions are the ones that are the result of the integration of two positions. So as I mentioned, national identity is a good example of that. I have my New Zealand identity, I have my Australian identity, I have a third position, which is a New Zealand Australian. And that often takes some time to work through to come to terms with what that new identity is and how it reconciles the two contributing identities. I'll be very interested when my son grows up a little bit more to see what he makes of himself, basically being having three nationalities contributing to his self-identity. And then there's promoter positions, and these are the really good ones. These are the ones that are actually pushing us forward, giving us the resources to tackle problems, work through challenges, achieve our goals. These are the coaches, these are the educators in our dialogical self that help us understand what we need to do to move forward and move through those challenging moments. So these I positions, we can use them, we can see them as directors, leaders, script writers in the democratic organization of the self. And that democratic element is something that Hubert Hermans is writing about a lot at the moment, looking at how we can reconcile this complex dialogical self, both in ourselves and in the relationship that we have with the world, into a much more democratic and empowering narrative than many people feel at the moment. Excuse me. So the chapter that I and Peter McElveen contributed to the book Career Theories and Models at Work is focused on the My Career chapter, which you could take as an example of using dialogical self in practice. This webinar is going to be less about my career chapter and more about the dialogical self. So I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. I will refer to the My Career chapter, but if you want to learn particularly about that resource, that intervention, the chapter's the place to go. I'm going to talk more about the theory underpinning it and a few other methods that you can use to implement it in practice. The first step of any work with dialogical self is to help your client to identify some of their I positions or to articulate them and to give them a name and allow them to recognize these positions, these influences, that may or may not be helpful to the way that they're trying to develop or progress in their life. One way to do this, and this comes from my career chapter, draws on Mary Mann's systems theory framework, which you can read about in the CERIC book. Systems theory framework articulates an approach that considers all the influences that act on people in their career development and their life in general. And what Peter McElveen, who created my career chapter, has done is he's taken internal influences and he's taken external influences and created this matrix. And what you ask the client to do is to work their way through the matrix and identify where these things interact. Is that a compatible or an incompatible relationship? So I'll draw on my own life a little bit again. And so, as I mentioned, I am living in a country that is not my own. The reason I've done that is for family and for my career. So in terms of my career and my family, it's very, very compatible because, as I mentioned, my father comes from Queensland, where I live now. I have a lot of cousins. I have my aunties and uncles living here. I've visited here many times in my life. So I give that a +2. That's very, very compatible. However, my career and my location are not quite as compatible and the reason for that is, although I love my job at the University of Southern Queensland, there's one university here in Toowoomba. So in other locations, I'd feel a little bit more confident about my ability to adapt and get a different job if I needed to. So my location is fantastic for some reasons. In terms of my career, it's really good, but it's not quite perfect. My culture, being Australian and New Zealand, you might know the cultural differences are minimal. I won't say it's like Canada and America. It's a lot closer than that, I think. So my culture and my location, whether I'm living in New Zealand or whether I'm living in Australia, my culture is the same, essentially. So that's very compatible. However, my family and my culture is quite interesting because, as I mentioned, I have quite a mixed family. My wife is from Vietnam. My son has 3 nationalities. And although we get along very well and we have a great relationship, there are cultural differences. And so there are times where we're not quite on the same page. We have different approaches. We have homesickness and things. So whether I'm in her country or she's in mine, there's always things that we need to be conscious of and careful about. So that's a quick example from my perspective. I'd like you to ask yourself a question about those influences and how they interact. How would you rate the compatibility between your current location and your career? -2, not at all compatible. Well, very much incompatible. 1, -1 would be mostly. Neutral can be 0, and so on. Okay, that's good. We're a pretty happy bunch, mostly compatible, very much compatible. A few people, expressing that things are not so compatible. So regardless of the results, this is another example of how we could use the dialogical self, because if we do have these multiple positions, our location and our career, the conjunction of that represents an I position. That I position is the person in their career, in their location. And there may be another position that wishes we were in a different location or in a different career, speaking to us, telling us, you need to do something about this, scolding us, why did you make this decision? And so these sort of methods can help us articulate some of these voices that are acting on us that we might not be speaking out loud, but we're certainly hearing and feeling the effect of. I'll share with you another example. This comes from an article by Gawalinska et al. And they use paintings. So they provide, I believe it was postcards of famous paintings that you could, you could get those books of them, present them to your client, and then after a bit of an open-ended discussion about personal stories based on a selection of those paintings that the client chooses, they do a similar sort of matrix exercise where they take each painting, they explore the effective meaning of the paintings by assigning them an emotion, such as maybe joy or anxiety or strength or connectedness or something like that, and then also giving it a 6-point ratings on a scale of how strong that is. So this is another example of how the dialogical self I positions could be drawn out by responses to a painting. So for example, they could say that this painting is a sad painting, a very strong sad painting. I'm going to rate it 6 in sadness. And that represents a voice that they experience. Their response to it comes from somewhere, And essentially what we're doing is allowing the voice that considers that painting to be very sad to articulate itself, and setting that up for a response from a different eye position, or maybe one of those meta positions, or some other way for that to be confronted by the client. The Lifeline, I know that many of you will use the Lifeline in your practice, where you get the client to sketch out, their past, their present, and their future on a time scale with the peaks and the troughs. And if we take a look at this fictional example that I drew up, you could see that all of these little turning points, they could represent a eye position in and of themselves. So the person who left home and didn't have a great experience of leaving home after I guess they went to university, but feels much better once they have settled down with their family, you could compare the voices, the experiences, the perspectives of those two positions, the person leaving home and the person establishing a new home. Similarly, someone experienced the high point of joining a fantastic graduate program in their work life, compared to the person who burns out from that experience. Again, you could set those two eye positions up in dialogue with each other and see if you can come to if you could reconcile the difference between them, or if you could identify what the tension might be between them. I quite like to use this one because I'm someone who's currently in a learning experience, and so this is something that I enjoy using with students when they're learning a new skill and maybe having some difficulty with it. We take the positions at one end, the novice, and at the other end, the master. I like to use Kung Fu Panda as my metaphor for this. We have the panda, and we have his sensei encouraging him along the journey. We have a motivator. We have the reason of why we are trying to learn this skill. So what is the position that is telling us, hey, you need to learn how to do this. You need to learn how to do statistics. You need to learn how to drive a truck or something like that. The voice that's telling us that this is necessary for our success in our life. The novice, of course, speaking from a point of maybe trepidation. Ambition comes into it, but maybe feeling quite nervous, whereas the master can speak from a voice of they know the difficulty of the journey, they've been through it, they know what's necessary to get there. And along the sides there, we also have eye positions that could represent a supporter, someone coming along with us and saying, yes, you can do it. But also, unfortunately, there will be people in our lives, perhaps, or maybe we perceive people in our lives to be naysayers, telling us you're not good enough. Why are you even bothering with this? That can be, of course, the classical imposter syndrome at work. It can also be sometimes that people are remembering harsh words from actual people in their lives. So dialogical self often reflects the internalization of things that have actually been said out loud in their life, and they become they weigh people down, even though a lot of time might have passed, or maybe that word was spoken in rashness. So dialogical self is quite interesting because we can take other people's voices and apply them in the dialogical self. I've used this a lot to help people understand that the learning process and the kind of things that will happen along the way, and draw out some of those resources that will sustain them during the difficult times. On a similar note, I work in universities, and so a lot of the work that I do is students come into a decision, and they often will second guess their decisions, or they'll go down one path and then want to change to another one. And so while helping them make the decisions, I like to do a couple of things. One is to help them understand that often when they make a decision, they think that they're going to change their life entirely, that everything will change about their life. But helping them understand that no matter what their decision makes, they're still going to be the same people, and they'll still be sharing a lot of the same qualities. They'll still be able to satisfy a lot of the same interests, and so on. So that's why I use these Venn diagrams to represent that a decision in the past or a decision in the future isn't necessarily going to send them off in some totally different pathway. The other way that I use this is to establish eye positions for people who are making a rational decision, a well-informed decision that they feel confident about, and then giving that the voice or the position that has made that decision, imbuing that voice with some authority, by encouraging the student to say that the position that made this decision was informed, they were cautious, they were careful, they sought advice, they looked at all the angles, and they made this decision. Because in the future, the I position that is going to second guess them and say that was wrong, that was dumb, that was silly, what were we thinking, might not be quite so credible. And so by framing these in the dialogical self and making them into I positions, expressing opinions, it allows the client in the future to use a meta position to say, which one of these voices is more credible to me? Is the person who made the decision in the first place more credible, or is the one that's second guessing it now more credible? And we can really only do that if we sort of create personas for those, which is what I positions are. Now, I know that there's a lot of really creative educators in this webinar, so I'm just going to encourage you to share using the question function, not the chat box, the question function, some of the other activities that might have occurred to you that you could use to draw out people's I positions. I've described just a couple that I use, but I'm sure that there's a multitude of really creative, really interesting ways that we could get people exploring all the different positions that they might have and giving them a little bit of voice. The second part of the process, at least my process and approach to dialogical self, is to getting the words flowing, because remember, I come from an English language teaching background, so I'm really enjoy getting people sort of activating their language, activating their vocabulary, expressing themselves on paper and by their voice. And so this is one of my favorite parts, where we've sort of created a couple of characters, so to speak, in the I positions, and we can set them up in dialogue now and start getting the words flowing. When I say dialogue, I think it's important to note that obviously we can create a dialogue, we could create a screenplay or something like that. But just because we're using the word dialogue doesn't mean that we have to give each persona a specific name and they have to actually talk to each other. There's a lot of other ways that you can do it. Some people struggle with language. They don't have maybe the vocabulary that they need to express some of these I positions and what they're feeling. So assessments and inventories can be a great way, not only to establish I positions, but also to give people a little bit of a prompt in terms of the language that they can use to describe them. So I'm a big fan of the VIA Character Strength Survey. That's a positive psychology-based assessment run by Martin Seligman and his colleagues, that takes 24 character strengths, and through a survey it ranks them from top to bottom. It doesn't imply that the ones at the bottom are not your strengths, it's just that they're lesser strengths perhaps. And I find that really quite interesting because it's quite empowering, and the resources that it provides in terms of the language is really fantastic. So these are my top 3 when I did the survey some time ago: judgment, love of learning, and love. So judgment and love of learning, you can certainly see why I might be doing a PhD. Love, you might have picked up that my family is very important to me. And so those little descriptions are enough in my experience to give people a start to respond to those. And you'll see people borrowing some of the words and some of the sentences, responding to them, maybe contradicting them, but it gives people something to start with rather than just a blank page. Sentence stems is another one, and so this is something that Peter McElveen based my career chapter on. My career chapter is, the main part of it is a series of sentence stems based on those influences that we looked at in that little in the matrix that we start with. So in terms of location, things like I come from, my home is, and people can fill those out with as much detail and elaboration as they need to. I use that as inspiration in my own work at my previous university, La Trobe University, using the VIA character strengths. So for example, ever since I was a child, people have told me I am, or I have, a love of learning. You need to encourage people to elaborate on these, because sometimes they'll just put down 1 word or 2 words, but you're really looking to draw out some detail and elaboration so that people can make these their own and really express some of the characteristics of the I positions that we're drawing out. I'm a big fan of this one too. You might know the Firewise Method. I prefer to call it the 3-year-old career counselor. My 3-year-old career counselor is now 6 years old, but he still asks a lot of why questions. So, you can help your client by setting them up. They've expressed something in an I position, and you can ask them, let's ask that I position, why don't they like that idea? And then whatever the response might be, we interrogate it further, but why do they feel that? And as you go down the way, you start to, the idea of this method, which is used in business quite a lot to find the root cause of challenges and problems, is that by delving deeper into the why and the why and the why, you eventually come to the root cause of the problem. And so this is a good way to really start to interrogate and confront an I position that might be experiencing anxiety or trepidation, to say to that I position, what is this really about? Because as we know as career counsellors, quite often the initial expression that we get from a client is sort of masking something else. So now we've identified some I positions, we've looked at a couple of ways that we can draw out some language and get some dialogue happening between them. Now this can happen in writing, it can happen verbally, it can happen in a counselling relationship. You can get people doing it in groups and in pairs. There's an important part of the stage now, which is to respond to them, because what we've done is we've given voice to these positions. And as we know, some of these positions might be biased, some of them might not be entirely helpful. So it's important that we take it to that next step and respond to them and start to edit some of these positions into more helpful statements. So my career chapter uses the method of externalizing some of these positions. So after writing these sentence stems that I showed you and doing a bit of an editing process to bring it into more of a cohesive text, my career chapter instructs the client adopt the I position of editor. So editor is explicitly one of those meta positions, the one that makes judgments on what is useful and what's not, what's important and what's not, how are we organizing things, and then read the text out loud as you were to yourself as you were 5 years ago. So that's setting up another I position for the client. So we'd have two here, the editor and the person from 5 years ago. So that's really asking the client to adopt or sort of to express two different I positions in a literal dialogue. And there's other ways that you can frame that depending on the different methods that you've been using. So one of the ones that I showed you was about decision making. So you could ask your client to adopt the I position of the decision maker, the person that has the authority to make decisions and, is the best informed and most credible person, and explain your decision to your future uncertain self. So that's something we have to do all the time in our real life. You have to explain to your boss why you took a certain course of action, or you need to explain to your spouse why, you should move. Or something like that. And so this is something that we can do for ourselves as well. I chose to do this because, and in the future, you're going to feel anxious about this, you're going to feel uncertain about it, but here's why we are doing it. I like putting that down on paper. In fact, I tell students to put it on paper, put it on their notice board or in front of their computer so that they can refer to it when they start to have those doubts. We can also set up that classical dialogue between the master and the novice. Daniel and Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid, adopt the I position of the future master and you outline a practice regime to your novice self. Okay, so you're going to give me 20 push-ups, you're going to do this much writing, you're going to read these books, you're going to go talk to these people. This is what you're going to do to get to meet your goal to develop the skills that you need. So again, the master has the authority. They know what's necessary to get things done, and the role of the novice is to follow those instructions. So those I positions again can be quite motivating to say, okay, I am a novice, I am learning, but there is something guiding me along the way. Sometimes the client, I've had people say, well, I'm not a master, how do I know? And so they can, my suggestion is that they find the master, they find a mentor, they find someone who can give them some advice and some instruction, and then they adopt that I position so they hear it in their voice. And in fact, many people, like people doing PhDs, one of the I positions will probably be their supervisor telling them, it's time to finish that draft, it's time to think about publishing that paper. And that will often be heard in the voice of their supervisor. Sometimes that's a kindly voice, unfortunate in my case, sometimes not so, in which case you do need to be careful with setting up this kind of dialogue. And also, if we look at the coach, similar to the master and the novice, you can adopt the I position of the coach and dictate the game plan to your team of selves. And I use the team of selves sometimes as well to say that we often have different strengths within ourselves. So for example, I enjoy writing, I'm quite good at it, but I'm also a procrastinator. And the procrastinator is a cogitator. He likes to think a lot and mull things over. And that's a strength, I mean, because that does allow me to, you know, form my opinions and form my how I'm going to express myself. But at the same time, I do need the writer to crack the whip and get the procrastinator to work. So, you know, my game plan can be, okay, well, we're going to give the cogitator this much time to think on the problem, and then at this time we're going to get the writer. He's going to come in. He's going to start writing things. The editor will come in at that point. So, considering a team of people playing a different role, you know, this position in myself is good at this, whereas I need to switch into this at another time. That can also be quite useful because it's not. Because it's cooperative. It's saying that all of these parts that contribute to ourself are important to us. We don't need to shut one of them down entirely because no one of them can sustain us. And I've found that to be quite useful myself in terms of managing my PhD, my work, and my family. At times, as I wrote in the blog that I published for CEREC on the CareerWise blog, you know, they can compete for priority to say, no, family's more important, no, the PhD is more important, no, the work's most important. And so considering them a team that are all trying to progress both my own career, but also the security of my family, you know, they're working together. And so this metaphor really works for me. Some of you might be familiar with The Work by Byron Katie. This is a great method for confronting and interrogating those very strident negative I positions, the people that say, you're never going to be a success at this because you're not good at it, things like that, or that this is too risky, you're totally going to fail, or the imposter syndrome, for example, that you're not good enough, soon you're going to be found out as a fraud. So the work consists of 4 steps. Really to confront the veracity of any sort of internal claim or anxiety that a client might express. The first question is simply, is it true? Is what you're saying, is it factual? Is there a basis in reality for that? And the client will often say, well, yes, it is. The second question interrogates that a little bit closer to say, can you absolutely know that it's true? Like, do you have all the information? Is this something that you can actually know the facts about? Because a lot of these things will be things that we can't know. We don't know what will happen in the future. We don't know what other people are thinking. Often we need to take a leap of faith and allow happenstance room to happen. So can you absolutely know it's true? How do you react when you believe it? So what are the emotions that this belief evoking, you know, to really highlight the fact that this is an emotive sort of experience for the client? And who would you be without it? So that's the empowering one. If you don't believe this, what would be different in your life? And so that's where people can sort of identify, well, if I didn't believe this, then I'd be taking action, or I'd be feeling more confident or less anxious. And then so the last part as well is there's an extension of the work, and that's to turn the thought around and tell me why the opposite of the initial belief is true. So if someone's saying I'm an imposter, I'm a fraud, after working through this, you can turn it back to them and say, okay, now that you're, you know, let's write a statement and explain why you are credible and why you are an authority, why you are an expert, you know, and get them to do the same sort of work. And ideally, you'd see that the evidence for them being an imposter is weaker than the evidence for them being, you know, competent and confident, or at least equal. So we can recognize that there are 2 sides to that story, that the expression of you are a fraud is simply one I position's opinion. It's not an authoritative statement, and it may not be based in evidence. Of course, this gets complicated when they've had an external other, you know, tell them that, because that voice becomes internalized, and that's a very credible sort of voice because it came from someone else. They can be very hard to work through. So I'd just like to ask another poll. I've described 3 steps to this point. The initial text, you know, generating the initial text, so that's establishing the I positions, responding to the I positions in the first instance, and then also responding to the responses. So that's the third iteration where you're sharing, they're starting to integrate the responses and mediate them. Okay, so we have a few different ideas. Look, obviously establishing the initial text is very important, because without that we don't really have anything to work with. But I would agree with people who have said the response to the response. Now let me explain what I mean by that. If we're taking this approach that we are first establishing an initial text. So this is where someone would say, you're dumb, you're a fraud, you can't do this, it's impossible, silly idea, all those sorts of things. The initial text is good because it's giving voice to that, and we all know the importance of giving voice to these feelings, because putting them out there is the first step in confronting them, whether it's speaking them to a counsellor or putting them on paper for ourselves or for an educator. So it's the initial text, the initial statement that exposes an I position to critique, because a lot of our internal I positions, they need and they deserve some critique because they're not entirely credible. The next step would be to respond to that, provide a counterpoint. You know, no, I'm not, you are, sort of thing. The danger here, I guess, is that what we've done here is we've established a conflict. We've said, well, there's one strong position and there's another strong antagonistic position. If we leave it at this point, there is a risk that we're just going to leave that conflict to fester. We're not actually really doing much to help the client move through those feelings. And so in my opinion, the third response, the response to the response, allows the meta, the third, or the promoter positions to emerge, to evaluate the credence and the validity of both positions, to do a little bit of mediating, and to see what we can do to take it forward, to be proactive, to move through the challenging experiences that has brought the client to us, and to establish a more productive narrative. We might look for a third position. Can we integrate those two? In this case, maybe not. We would maybe need to draw on a meta position to say, well, you know, your claims aren't quite as credible as the other positions, and then promoter positions to say, okay, let's drop this, let's stop arguing with each other, let's see what we can do to move forward. So in my opinion, it's important, if you're using this method, not just to do a lot of stuff to agitate these I positions, to bring them out, give them voice, and then leave them like that, because we're sort of leaving some things undone. We really need to help the client start to evaluate, organize, mediate these positions, and start to see, well, which ones am I going to draw on, or how am I going to manage these in order to be a little bit more comfortable with the way things are going. Synthesizing, of course, you know, often these activities will be generating lots and lots of ideas, you know, mind maps and brainstorming and sentence stems, all these things. So I think it's important also to give the person a chance to bring them in together, because currently we sort of have a mess. We've set off this big storm of discussion and dialogue inside our client's mind. So having a conclusion to it, to say, okay, well, what are we going to do with all this? How are we going to bring it together, I think is also an important step. So my career chapter uses sentence stems again to write a conclusion. So the editor, they go over all the material that the client's generated in that manuscript of those sentence stems and the matrix, and they look at their strengths. They take a strengths-based approach, and they talk about how, you know, what they've talked about in the course of that intervention, how they're going to bring that together and take it into the future. And an approach that I'm developing right now as part of my PhD and my practice at USQ, again, I use the VIA to look at character strengths. I asked the student to write an initial statement about why they are studying what they're studying. In the case that my PhD will focus on, I'm looking at health practitioners such as nurses. Why did you choose to become a nurse? The initial statement will be quite naive, quite undeveloped. It will amount to little more than I want to help people. But after going through a dialogical process like the ones that I've described, I would expect to have a much richer and more developed and more elaborated statement. And so we take that first statement, and then on the basis of all the work that they've done, on the feedback that they've received from mentors, on the assessment, on the cogitation that they've done, they revise that statement, and we're looking for you know, as I said, a much more mature understanding of how things are going for them. Other ways of editing and rewriting, again, I'm drawing on my background as an English language teacher here. I used to use this for people, you know, learning a second language in an academic environment, reading their draft out into a tape recorder or into their cell phone, and then listening back and transcribing it. Is a good way, because when you transcribe, you edit, because you notice some of the things that don't quite make sense, or some of the poor grammar, or some of the poor word choices. So transcription is a good way of editing. I also like to get people to write a draft, read it, and then I take the draft away from them and I say rewrite that by memory, because that tends to mean that they're going to remember the most important things, and they have a little bit more freedom to add or revise things along the way. And similarly, if they were working in handwriting, you ask them to type it up, because again, typing a handwritten draft is a form of editing, and they'll make certain decisions about improving and changing that along the way, and vice versa, handwriting from a typed draft. Something I really like to do as well, in my experience, sometimes university students and many people, they hesitate to describe themselves in a simple way. Like, they don't like to say, I am a good educator, I am a fantastic nurse, or something like that. So the dialogical self, I find sometimes it's very useful after doing this work. They might have a page of paper, and I'll say to them, okay, take that page, I want you to write just one paragraph that encapsulates all of that great stuff. Very difficult task to do, because it requires them to be concise, which concision is a very important skill for career development, because, you know, if you're writing a cover letter, you can't ramble on. If they can get down to a paragraph, I'll tell them, let's get down to a sentence. A sentence could be the headline on your LinkedIn profile. It could be, you know, the elevator pitch that you might use at a networking event, and so on. And, you know, not everybody can do it, but sometimes you can get down from one page to what I call one powerful word. And I've had a student do this, and they had this whole page about, you know, what they want to do with their life. They want to help people, they want to do this, that, and the other thing. And when they got down to one powerful word, the word was educator, and they hadn't actually realized that about themselves. They had a sense that they wanted to do things to help people. They didn't quite know how. And by working through this process, we came down to one word, which gave them a little bit of understanding of how they wanted to help people, what the contribution they wanted to make. And related to that, this work is often quite introspective, quite reflective. If you join Rana Kalingal's webinar on career writing, you'll see that she uses a lot of creative methods, a lot of very expressive methods, you know, poetry, free writing, things like that. Sometimes when I'm working with university students, we need to be a bit more pragmatic, because we're talking about things like resumes and cover letters. I do use this method, these creative methods, to get some great language coming out, and to get some really sincere, heartfelt expressions. And then I help the students rewrite some of that material more for an audience, for a professional audience. So taking some of these dialogical self expressions and things that they've written, and put it into a resume, use some of that great language in a cover letter. As I mentioned, if we can get a great sentence from it, that might become our LinkedIn headline, and we might draw on some of this in an interview, because we all know that when we present for a job interview, sometimes it's the motivation. You know, who are you? What are you all about? Why are you doing this? Some of these deep and meaningful questions that are really going to have as much impact as some of the competency questions. And so dialogical self can be a great way to help uncover some of those strengths. I'm getting to the end of the webinar. I'd love to have questions. There will be some time for questions, so if you've got any questions, you could start filling them out in the question function, and Suriel will forward them on to me. We've got a couple in there that I'll address in a moment. I've got a bit of recommended reading. Forgive me for self-promotion, but recommended reading is, of course, the chapter in the book Career Theories and Models at Work by Sarek. It's a very affordable book, and it's you know, it's a great overview of contemporary and a very diverse range of theories. I've written an additional chapter about my career chapter and the dialogical self in this book, edited by Franz Myers and Hubert Hermans, where Peter McElveen and I and our colleague Sarah Hammer talk about using my career chapter in higher education in particular. And the introduction to this book is itself a really good introduction to dialogical self. So if you're looking for just a good introduction to dialogical self, this book, the introduction to this book, has a very good one. And then, as I mentioned, this book also edited by Mary Mann and Mark Watson, has also, a very good introduction to career learning, which is a theory of learning for careers informed very much by dialogical self, written by Franz Myers and Reineke Lengel, and then career writing. Again, Reineke is going to present on career writing. She has a chapter in the book Career Models and Theories at Work on career writing, and so that's a specific method that my career chapter is a kind of career writing. As I mentioned, Reineke's career writing tends to be more creative and expressive, so it's my inspiration for doing the work that I'm doing. I'd also invite people to have a look at my LinkedIn profile, because I've written a few articles that I'm very proud of in terms of expressing the way that I approach some of these things in my work at universities and my PhD. So if you're looking for some more stuff about what I'm up to and what I'm thinking, I'd love for you to come along and have a look and leave a comment. I think it's time I could address some of these questions. I don't know if I'll have time to go through them all. I'm sure Surya is going to interrupt me soon and tell me to wind up. But if you have further questions, you could tweet me at Mojo Healy or email me at michael.healy@USQ. So there's a question here from Carol about the children, or a comment, children of immigrants may feel dual ethnicity. And people, and highlighting that in Canada, of course, you've got the French and the English culture. So that's a really good point. And you don't have to have moved yourself from cultures. It could be that you were born in a particular culture, because I know that when I was growing up in New Zealand, even having my Australian father, I actually did have that kind of thing happening. Obviously, it's not as much of an impact as someone from different cultures, but it certainly is true there. Compatibility is subjective, says Charlene. So going back to the compatibility of location and career. And she asked a question, so if it's so subjective and each individual interprets their own compatibility between, say, their location and their career, how do you help problem solve with clients if nothing can be done about the location compatibility? So that's a very good point. So, when we're looking at the compatibility of those influences, going back to that matrix that I showed you, what happens if it's totally incompatible? There are people that cannot move location. There are people that, might be stuck in a career, they feel. So look, this method isn't necessarily about finding a solution to every problem. This method, in my opinion, is a good way to articulate the problem, because some clients sometimes maybe haven't been able to put into words what the real problem is. If they feel stuck in a career, maybe they haven't said that out loud. If they feel stuck in a location or they're not satisfied where they are, maybe they haven't said that out loud. Of course, people who work with immigrants and refugees would probably have more to say about this, because they have that expertise and that experience. I don't necessarily work with groups like that, so my ability to talk to how to talk to people, or how to help people that are experienced like outright marginalization is quite limited. So we've got a lot of great ideas about how to draw out eye positions. We've got vision boarding suggested, sports, talking about sporting activities and roles that people play in teams, I guess. Describe careers that they thought of as a young child, Lynn has suggested. So that's a great one, because those positions are often expressive of influences from media and from family and from culture and community. So, and sometimes people hold on to those even if they don't quite know it. Story mapping, storyboarding, growth and fixed mindsets. So Kerry Brock had a great suggestion there. So in terms of eye position, a growth eye position and a fixed eye position can come to can come to, you know, some sort of dialogue about how they're conflicting or how they might be able to work together. Marissa Brown suggests Lego Serious Play, which I really love. I've used Lego Serious Play. If you're not familiar with it, it's essentially giving your clients a bunch of Lego and asking them to build their career or build a location or build a workplace or something like that. Similar to being, you know, like drawing a picture or sketching out something in prose. So actually, that's fantastic. I know that some of my colleagues in Australia use Lego Serious Play quite a lot in their work. I've had a question here. Can anything be an I position, or is there a specific list of I positions? Can a client come up to it with I positions that are appropriate to them, like the gamer? And Joshua, you're absolutely right. There is no list of I positions. This is not a quantitative method. There's no categories of I positions that we are going to offer to clients. It's really about them. It's really about the voices and the personas that they experience. And so if someone is a gamer and that's part of their identity, and that's either giving them, you know, helping them, or it's you know, it's a hindrance to them, then that's something that that you can work through with them. What does it mean for them? So what are the, you know, what are the perspectives? What are the biases? What are the opinions of that person, that position? What are their ambitions? And if it is something that is harming them, you know, you can talk through what are we going to do to mediate this, the influence of this particular position, and so on. So no, Joshua, to answer your question, I positions are really subjective. They're really up to the client and you to draw out and discuss. Just working my way through some more questions. Sorry, I'll jump in if I'm running out of time, please. Candy, thank you. Candy, I met you in Vietnam. It was such a pleasure to meet you and John in the bus from the conference to the hotel. You're welcome. She says, thanks for spending your early morning with us. As you can see, the sun's come up, so it's time to get ready for work shortly. I am familiar with, Candy's asked me if I'm familiar with Gallup's Strengths Finder. I'm familiar with it. I haven't used it much. I know people that have, but I would say that this is something very similar to the VIA. Character strengths assessment. It basically is a shortcut to I positions, I would say, because through the assessment, it essentially presents a selection of I positions to the student to say that you are good at this, you have this strength, you are strongly value, you know, you value this, which they can, you know, they can choose to take up what's most relevant to them. They can discard things that are not. But I find that in classes of students, you know, who may be reticent, they're not used to reflecting like this, an assessment like the Strengths Finder or VIA character strengths, or even things like the Holland codes, can essentially present them a few options that they could pick up as they choose, and you could work with them to articulate the I positions that might go with the results of those assessments. Yvonne, she notes, always taking care with students asking, defending a decision or exploring why they made a decision because they may be defensive. So Yvonne, still, when, you know, if she's got a defensive client, I still question them, but try to use words such as tell me how you arrived at this decision. My take on using why, you know, I do that in a bit of a facetious way. So if I'm doing the why, I try not to do it in such a confronting way. I present it as, imagine you've got a 3-year-old kid, you know, who's just constantly asking why. You can certainly change the language of that particular activity to take it away from why, but you might change why to tell me more, or something like that. Because yeah, sometimes people are defensive. Sometimes they don't like to be second-guessed or second-guess themselves.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Cyril. I'll hand it back to you. There are a few more questions, but I'll answer those by email because I think people in Canada want to go home. I've got to get up and feed the family shortly.
Yeah, it was really great to see all the questions coming through the webinar. So thank you all for your engagement today. And as you see, and as you said, Michael, yeah, you share your contact, and I encourage you all to contact you, Michael, through social media or email. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation today. That was very great to learn more about the different eye positions and how career practitioners can use the dialogical self theory to support and help their client. So thank you. All right, so you can learn more about the Career Theories and Model at Work book, including how you can get your own copy at ceric.ca/series. And because we are working on next free webinar series featuring more authors of the book, we encourage you to visit our website and subscribe to our newsletters on ceric.ca/webinars. Also, Michael shared with you some books to read, including one from Reneke Lengel, and I'm happy to say that Reneke will be with us on Thursday to deliver a webinar on her chapters. But as for now, our webinar series continues, so we'll see you back tomorrow, Wednesday, July 10, or it will be on this side of the world, with Deborah Osborne from US, who will talk about her cognitive information processing theory. And now it's time for you to tell us what you think of this webinar today. So a short evaluation survey will pop up on your screen as soon as the webinar ends. We will really appreciate you completing it to provide us with your feedback. Thank you everyone for joining us and have a good day.